All right, so let's move to our first speaker. Our first speaker, as you can see, is Oren from Cloudflare, and his role is security leadership. Oren was the founder and the CEO of Area 1 Security prior to acquisition by Cloudflare. And previously, he had senior positions at the National Security Agency and the United States Cyber Command, focused on computer network operation and big data. Oren holds numerous patents and is an avid fan of bow tie Thursdays. Unfortunately, today is a Tuesday. Otherwise, we really can see the bow tie, what kind of bow tie he wears. And Oren will talk about the reality of phishing. You are going to need a bigger boat.
Okay, great. Well, thanks so much. Appreciate that introduction. So let's get started. Just for a little bit of context, I think some of the insights that I'm going to be making have to do with my experience, and they have to do with real world events. And some of those events are built on the vast network that Cloudflare services are built on. And so just give some people's perspective. Cloudflare, many people are familiar with the products like the CDN and the WAF and so forth, but really at the heart of what it is that we do is we have a global network, right, that tries to bring access and security and reliability and build a better internet by being as close to people and delivering data. And it's that network that gives us a lot of insights and a lot of capabilities, particularly as it relates to phishing, preempting phishing, and being comprehensive in that fight. So today, right, being a bad guy on the internet, it's just a really good business. And it only costs a few pennies to go register like a new domain, to go spin up a new Office 365 or a Gmail tenant, and to start sending emails. And the facts are that like if you send 10 emails to an organization, there's a 90% success rate that one person is going to click or interact with that. And so we need to take a step back and think about, well, what is this phishing, right? Because 95% of all the breaches that exist in the world today, the damages, if you go all the way back and figure out how did it begin, what was the initial vector, what was the initial entry point, you'll find that phishing was the initial root cause. And so whether the effect, right, the damage or the problem that you see when the thing goes boom is ransomware or business email compromise, which has caused 66 times more damage than ransomware in the past several years, or if you call it spear phishing, or if you call it spam, or if you call it malvertising, or if you call it watering holes or credential harvesting or so forth, they're all really the same thing, right? They're an attempt to get an individual just like you and me to take an action, and that action unwittingly leads an attacker or a bad guy to gain access into a network, to gain information, to gain monies, to achieve their objectives. And that's at the core of what I want to talk about and give people some strategies, show some examples. But before we get into that, I think it's important to realize it's all the same thing. These are all phishing, and that's the problem that we want to take on straight on. When I worked at the National Security Agency and was responsible for breaking into computers for the US government, phishing was the thing that we used, right? We would deploy it successfully, and it remains that way today because computer hacking is an endeavor that people like to talk about as being sophisticated, but it's really an endeavor that's about the effort of least resistance. And so, you're not going to see attackers use quantum computing, 0 days, sophisticated breakthroughs in computer science, when all they need to do is wake up, send 10 emails, and know that in 9 and 10 of those cases, they're going to get what it is they wanted to begin. What we do see change, though, are some of the patterns in how the phishing attacks play out. Maybe in the past, people are familiar with email only. Sometimes there are non-email based attacks. Mostly what we're seeing today is a greater focus on supply chain based phishing, where the people that organizations are doing business with, the vendors that they trust, the partners that they have, they're suffering attacks. And the trust in that relationship online is being subverted to cause damage. And we're also seeing a significant rise in what we would call multi-channel attacks. And I have an example of this where, the phishing campaign, it might start through an SMS message, right? Which has a link, it leads you to a website, which gets into your network. And those are the types of tactics. If you take a further step back, again, I like to say that phishing is really only about one thing. It's about authenticity. That's often why these attacks work, because as humans, we're susceptible to a good story. We're often working quickly, and we want to trust the things that we see in front of us, both because of the technologies that we've enabled and because as a species, we're built around being trusting. And then authenticity typically comes in two forms. The first is in brands. So a lot of phishing campaigns are focused on subverting or mimicking the top brands in the world. And the major pattern, excuse me, or change that we see year over year is just the popularity of brands. So 10 years ago, there's no such thing as a TikTok phishing campaign. But today, as TikTok has risen in popularity, you see a lot of campaigns that are related to it. Or prior to the pandemic, you don't see COVID or flu vaccine or other related World Health Organization phishing campaigns. So these themes are temporal, right? They map to world events. When the UN General Assembly meets in New York, we see a rise in UN General Assembly meeting types of phishing themes. When there are elections in the United States or in Canada or elsewhere around the world, you see phishing themes elicit that. So that's one form of authenticity. The second is organizational authenticity, which is primarily related to business email compromise. And that business email compromise authenticity is about it looks like it's coming from the CEO or the CTO or a colleague and so forth. And when you break it down, right, that is the essence of what's required for folks to be vigilant about and what we focus our time on stopping. And we really think about this as being contextual, right? There's a form of contextual analysis which people are familiar with. It's like, let's study the headers, let's look at the body, information, deploying computer vision to look for logos. But there's also more advanced forms of context, which are like, well, what is it that they're talking about in the message, right? Like someone says, you know, pay me $1 million versus wire the money, here, when that's part of a thread where something has been negotiated, the sentiment, the tone, the severity, the need to take action, happens more closely. And so we want to bring all this context together to attack the advantage that the bad guys are trying to use. So I'll give some background on business email compromise and then go through a couple of scenarios that are or examples that are real world attacks. So as I mentioned, business email compromise, today is costing companies tens and tens of billions of dollars. It's vastly, underreported. And the latest numbers from the Federal Bureau of Investigation in the report show that BEC attacks are causing 66 times more damage than ransomware attacks, despite ransomware maybe being more prevalent in the news or in the headlines. We've divided the BEC space into three types. So we call type 1 BEC attacks as ones you might be familiar with, where it looks like it's coming from the CEO or from another executive or for a colleague. But if you were to hover over the to line in the message, you would see this as a simple display spoof and has kind of the call to action like go to the grocery store, buy gift cards. People are familiar with this. Now, despite all the awareness and training, that exists and probably how smart everyone is who's joining us today, we see that this is about 50-50 effective against users. Again, for all the reasons I mentioned before, which is people want to believe or they're working fast. And there are very few scenarios in large corporations and government scenarios in many different business contexts where if you get an email from the CEO, you're not going to say like, well, I thought your email looked funny, so I kind of deleted it, right? Type 2 business email compromise are when you've lost access or control to an account within your network. And now an attacker is using a legitimate account and starts emailing vendors, partners, colleagues, right? This is a very difficult sort of campaign to detect, but it's limited in the sense that like oftentimes employees don't ask each other for money. It often doesn't smell the test, and attackers have found this difficult to achieve their objectives. And so they've moved really to what's the most prevalent in the space, which are the type 3 attacks, where your partner, the people you trust, the people you do business with, the people you are familiar with communicating digitally, they've had an account breach. so the legitimate account has been taken over on the other side of the relationship. You're unable to understand that or to discern it, and now they're interceding in what are legitimate activities, and subverting those primarily for monies and intellectual property, and so forth. So I'll show you an example of one. So here, we've worked with a large uh, global airline for many years, and as you would expect, the airline like buys gasoline, right? This is not a unusual endeavor, right? That an airline would buy gasoline. It's also not unusual that they would buy like tens of millions of dollars of gasoline at any given time. And what they were unable to know, though, is that the people they're buying gasoline from had suffered an account takeover. It suffered a major loss of integrity in their networks. And so the attacker, as they're negotiating, and these are aliases like fuel at airline, and fuel receipts, and these messages, these negotiations are going on for weeks. They're being approved up and down the chain. They're multi-threaded. But at the very end of it, right, the attacker, using that context that I mentioned before, starts to change the pattern in the communications and demand monies, and demand differences. And that's the point where you want to step in and talk about. So this is kind of an example of things that we're seeing now. One thing I'd like to highlight for folks is that these BEC attacks are particularly damaging, because the way loss of money hits different companies can be crippling in different scenarios. So sometimes a Global 2000, a Fortune 500 company, right, has the ability to withstand a $24 million loss, right? But a small, medium-sized business, a startup, a nonprofit, a local school system, a municipality, right? Losing $10,000, $50,000 can be really crippling. That money doesn't come back in the same way. And that's where we see these attacks really having their greatest consequence. It's not so much the raw number, it's how that raw number impacts the various organizations that are involved in the attack. The second example I want to go through is something that we've written extensively about at Cloudflare. I have a link, and we can share it out as well. But if you go to our blog and you look at the mechanics of a sophisticated phishing scam and how we stopped it, we go into some depth to talk about an attack that came towards Cloudflare. And this is a good example of one of these multi-mode attacks that I was talking about at the beginning. So in this example, the attacker started emailing our colleagues with SMS messages, right? So not coming through email, right? And the SMS messages have links, and those links look to be from our identity access provider, Okta, and kind of matches the pattern, looks kind of legitimate, and people might click. When they click, right, they're presented with a screen that's pixel perfect. It's exactly what the login screen looks like. It's not difficult to discern, what that is, right? And so what we see is that, like, the threat actor, right, starts with sending the malicious SMSs, but company employees, as they start to receive these messages on their personal phones, on their work phones, they're interacting with the messages, they're clicking on them, but they're also starting to report them, right, to our security incident and response team. And as the threat actor starts to record the credentials that are being entered, one of the key strategies that we utilize is the use of hard tokens. So like Yubico keys, or we have these hard token keys in our computers. And so having the username and password, right, which is being harvested, it doesn't authenticate because we've added in this other component of our anti-phishing and our zero trust strategy, which essentially stops the attack in its space. And so what I would highlight here is that there are really three things, right, that have come into play. And a particular note is that we've had a strong culture of people reporting, so that by the time we see these failed login attempts, we're already being made aware that this attack is going on, allowing our team to respond and shut down the campaign, and ultimately suffering no damage. So we look at this as a massive success because we've built in the types of layers that are required. It's not surprising that attackers would go after a popular critical security service, and that's why you build these types of strategies in. So to sort of finish this component, what we like to talk about are maybe some next steps or best practices. What's been really critical is the technologies that we employ are the most key to solving and stopping the attack and preventing damages. but establishing a paranoid and blame-free culture where employees, with whether or not they make a mistake, they think something suspicious, or they just give us some early warning to respond faster, is really, really critical. And it's important for all organizations to be establishing that paranoid and blame-free culture. The second is to think about the attacks in the way that I described, which is that it's not just stopping malicious PDFs, right? Sometimes over the years, people say, well, this is the problem, stop malicious PDFs, or, don't do this, or, hover over this and so forth. But really, I think through the examples, what you should take away is that phishing is a comprehensive problem. It can start in a text message, it can lead to an email, it can lead to a website and so forth. And you need a comprehensive set of strategies and layers in order to be sufficient. And then the last, my personal favorite, what I call don't be basic. Essentially, if you look across your organization and the controls that you have in place, and you think, hey, we've got a cloud inbox, right? What can we do to take one more step forward every month, every quarter, every week, every year? That might be going from SMS, multi-factor authentication to the hard keys. That might be adding in a cloud-based email security solution. That might be, taking strategies, but using the basic out-of-the-box tools that are provided to you is the minimum that you can do. And the best thing you can be doing is assessing and taking one step forward consistently to raise the bar. Because as I said at the beginning, today being a bad guy on the internet is a really good business. And if you can make it a little bit more expensive, a little bit harder, you'll be very successful in stopping these phishing attacks. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right. Thank you very much, Oren. A few questions I got people. One question regarding the technology. So since the phishing in the industry, this term in the industry for so long, right? So is there any like a silver bullet kind of technology or very cool technology? I'm sure everyone has a cool technology, or Ubiquitol has a technology. Can we have a kind of one technology or a set of technology just we don't need to rely on people to make a judgment. So that technology can block all those phishing attacks at all, right? So
Well,
what's your opinions
absolutely.
on
I
that?
think, I think that, today the cybersecurity doom narrative has become incredibly embellished to where people think that it's not possible to be successful against, these bad guys or these malicious actors because we use terms like sophisticated attacks and unprecedented. The unfortunate reality is that none of the attacks that you read about are unprecedented or sophisticated. And so the best strategies, are what I outlined. It's important to use the people that we work with as part of the team and develop the culture because there are times when what they see, what they interact with gives you a time advantage. And so we really think about solving the problem from a time perspective. But if you're just using the basic out of the box, tools, you're going to be a little bit behind. And so you can keep up leveling those. That's not like endless numbers of tools, but those are some of the strategies that I talked about, which is an anti-phishing solution like Area 1 will eliminate, 99.997% of the malicious messages that might hit your inbox. But as I outlined, not all of the attacks come to the email inbox. Some of them start on the SMS. And so in that case, our hard tokens are very effective, right? They're also very effective because they're a much simpler way to authenticate access, right? They're really lightweight, they're really easy to deploy, they're really easy to install, and they're very, very, effective at putting them together. So that zero trust mindset, it's not so much like here's a product that you buy that's a silver bullet. It's about a methodology and about looking and evaluating your controls and improving them and getting them to be interoperable with one another. And I think from that, we see, customers and folks I've worked with over many years be very successful.